He asked for a divorce on my 50th birthday, in front of our children, and the people who watched our marriage for decades, turning a milestone into a public humiliation. And while everyone waited for me to fall apart, I was already holding the truth a lawyer had placed in my hands the night before. How do you react when the person trying to erase you has no idea you already know exactly who they are? My name is Margaret Collins. I am 52 years old and I live in the United States. For years I believed. Birthdays were meant to mark endurance, not endings. I expected that dinner to be distant, maybe uncomfortable but still private. I never imagined it would become the moment my marriage was quietly executed in front of witnesses. David waited. He waited until we were seated. He waited until the food was served. He waited until the candles were lit and our children were watching. He wanted timing. He wanted control. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, rehearsed and certain. He said he wanted a divorce. As if he were announcing a decision that no longer required my participation. The room froze. Emily stopped moving. Ryan stared at the table. I felt eyes searching my face, measuring my worth in that moment. David watched closely, not with concern, but with expectation. He wanted to see damage. He wanted confirmation that the timing had worked. I did not give it to him. I stayed still. I breathed. I nodded once and remained quiet. People believe silence is weakness. They rarely understand that silence can also be discipline. Inside my head, I was not confused. I was replaying the night before, sitting across from a lawyer who spoke carefully without emotion, placing documents in front of me that explained years of unease, financial decisions made without my consent, commitments that legally required me but were executed behind my back. Confidence built on the assumption I would never ask the right questions. That office changed everything. His certainty, his distance, his belief that this divorce would unfold, exactly as he planned, suddenly made sense. At the table, he framed separation as honesty, as growth, as something inevitable. He believed choosing my birthday would soften resistance. He believed humiliation would silence me. He believed witnesses would protect him. What he did not know was that the night before, I had already stopped being uninformed. If you are listening to this, tell me in the comments where you are listening from. That night, everyone believed I had been caught off guard. Only I knew that. His confidence was resting on something fragile, and that the ground beneath him had already begun to move. After that night, people assumed the worst about me. They believed I was numb, embarrassed, or broken by the way my marriage ended in front of witnesses. What no one understood was that my stillness was not confusion. It was calculation. I had learned long before that reacting too quickly only feeds the person who believes they are in control. The days that followed were quiet on the surface. David behaved like a man who had already closed the door emotionally. He spoke about logistics, schedules, and next steps as if the emotional part had already been settled. His tone was light, almost relieved. He assumed I would follow his lead the way I always had, and that assumption shaped every conversation. Our children avoided the subject. Emily watched me closely, as if she were waiting for something to collapse, while Ryan stayed distant, unsure of where loyalty belonged. I let them observe without explanation. I did not defend myself or justify my silence, because I knew this was not the moment for reassurance. This was the moment for restraint. David interpreted my quiet the same way he always had as permission. He began speaking freely about selling assets, restructuring accounts, and how clean everything would be once the divorce was finalized. He spoke as if outcomes were guaranteed, as if nothing stood between him and the life he had already planned. I listened carefully, not emotionally, not passively, but attentively. Every word confirmed what the lawyer had warned me about. Confidence built on ignorance often sounds like certainty. At night, I replayed the dinner again, not with pain, but with clarity. I saw how deliberately he had chosen the moment, how he waited for witnesses, how he believed the setting would protect him from being questioned. He had not asked for a divorce. He had announced it. What he never considered was that announcements do not erase consequences. The lawyer had been clear. Do not confront. Do not accuse. Do not react emotionally. Let him believe the story he created, because that belief was my protection. So I stayed calm, asked neutral questions, delayed nothing publicly, and rushed nothing privately. I behaved exactly like someone uninformed would. That confused him. Then it irritated him. He began asking why I was so quiet, why I was not angry, why I was not trying to negotiate. He mistook control for connection and silence for fear. I did not correct him because every day he felt more secure, and every day that security rested on a misunderstanding. If you are listening, stay with me. What looked like acceptance was not surrender. It was the space I needed to let him step further into a mistake he believed no one could see. What most people never saw was how long that moment had been forming. The divorce announcement did not begin at the dinner table. It began weeks earlier in small inconsistencies that were easy to dismiss if you trusted the person standing in front of you. Missing explanations, conversations that ended too quickly, financial decisions that were already made by the time I was informed. At first, I blamed myself for not paying attention sooner. The night before my birthday was supposed to be ordinary. David believed I was at home preparing for the dinner, thinking about guests and food and appearances. Instead, I was sitting in an office that smelled like paper and old coffee, listening to a lawyer explain my own marriage back to me in a language I had never been taught to speak. He did not dramatize anything. He did not raise his voice or suggest revenge. He spoke carefully, pointing to documents and timelines showing me how certain decisions had been made without my approval, and how long that pattern had existed. Each page felt heavier than the last, not because it shocked me, but because it confirmed something I had sensed for years and never named. That meeting changed how I saw everything that followed. It explained David's calm at the dinner table. It explained why he chose my birthday. He believed emotion would distract me. He believed shock would keep me quiet. He believed I would be too busy surviving the humiliation to notice the structure beneath it. What he underestimated was clarity. Sitting in that office, I did not feel anger. I felt grounded. For the first time in a long while, I understood the rules of the situation I was in. I understood what mattered and what did not. I understood why reacting emotionally would only serve the version of events he wanted others to see. When the lawyer finished, he looked at me and said something simple. He said timing matters, and silence can be strategic. That sentence stayed with me through the entire dinner the next night, through every look from our children, through every moment David believed he was in control. By the time he asked for the divorce, I already knew something he did not. The power dynamic he relied on was built on an assumption that no longer existed. He thought I was uninformed. He thought I was unprepared. He thought the story began when he spoke. In reality, the story had already shifted direction. He just had not reached that part yet. The days after my birthday moved forward, as if nothing significant had happened for anyone except me. David carried himself with a confidence that bordered on carelessness. He spoke openly about timelines and next steps, as if the outcome had already been decided, and all that remained was execution. He assumed I was still processing the shock, and that assumption made him reckless. I paid attention to everything, not in an obvious way. I listened the way someone does when they are no longer trying to be understood, but trying to understand the structure of what is happening around them. Each conversation confirmed how certain he was that I would not challenge anything. He had built his confidence over years of me trusting without questioning. The lawyer's words echoed quietly in my head. Do not interrupt the pattern. Let it reveal itself. I realized that David was not afraid of losing me. He was afraid of being slowed down. He wanted efficiency. He wanted clean edges. He wanted the narrative to move forward without resistance, because resistance would require explanations he was not prepared to give. What surprised me was how quickly he began to expose himself. He talked about finances as if I had no claim beyond what he decided was fair. He spoke about assets as if they belonged to him by default. It was not cruelty. It was habit. He had been operating this way for so long that he no longer recognized it as imbalance. I stayed calm and neutral. I asked questions without emotion. Not enough to alarm him, just enough to listen. Each answer added clarity. Each assumption he voiced confirmed how deeply he believed the rules favored him. He did not realize those rules only existed because I had never insisted on learning them before. At night, when the house was quiet, I revisited the documents in my mind. I remembered how carefully the lawyer had explained what mattered, and what was merely noise. I understood that this was not about winning an argument or proving a point. It was about letting truth surface naturally while he continued believing the version of events he had constructed. David mistook my calm for acceptance. That misunderstanding became his greatest weakness, because the more confident he felt, the less guarded he became, and the more clearly I could see exactly where his certainty would collapse when the time came. What made this stage difficult was not fear, but restraint. Every instinct tells you to defend yourself when you realize you have been underestimated for years. I had to resist that urge daily. David continued speaking as if the future was already mapped out and I was simply catching up. He explained things to me with a tone that assumed agreement, not discussion, and each time he did, I learned a little more about how narrow his understanding really was. He began outlining what he thought was fair, which accounts would be separated, which assets would remain untouched, which decisions he believed no longer required my involvement. He spoke confidently because he believed confidence was enough. He did not check himself. He did not slow down. He never once asked what I wanted or what I knew. I noticed how often he repeated the same phrases. Clean break, simple process, no need to complicate things. Those words were not meant to reassure me. They were meant to reassure him. He needed the divorce to remain uncomplicated, because complication meant exposure, and exposure meant answers. I stayed composed and listened carefully. I let him believe I was still catching my breath emotionally. I asked clarifying questions in a neutral tone, and watched how quickly he answered when he thought he was educating me rather than being evaluated. The more he explained, the more obvious it became that he had built his plans on assumptions rather than facts. What he did not realize was that every assumption he voiced was something the lawyer had already addressed. Every shortcut he expected to take had a consequence he had not prepared for. The gap between what he believed and what was real widened quietly while he continued moving forward without looking down. At night, I felt the weight of it. Not sadness, but responsibility. Knowing the truth means choosing how and when to use it. Reacting too early would have shifted the focus away from his choices and onto my emotions. Waiting allowed the pattern to complete itself. David mistook patience for delay. He believed time was on his side. That belief made him comfortable. And comfort made him careless. He did not see that each conversation brought him closer to a moment where his confidence would no longer protect him. The shift did not happen all at once. It happened in small, deliberate steps that David barely noticed at first. I stopped agreeing automatically. I asked for time before responding. I said I wanted to understand things better. None of it was confrontational. None of it sounded defensive. It was simply a woman beginning to participate in decisions that had always been presented as final. That subtle change unsettled him. He could feel something was different, even if he could not identify it. He asked why I needed more time, why I suddenly cared about details, why I wanted things in writing. His questions carried irritation, not concern, because concern would have required empathy, and this was about control slipping slowly from his hands. I remained steady. I explained that clarity mattered to me now, that I wanted to be careful, that this was still my life, even if the marriage was ending. Each answer was reasonable. Each explanation was calm. He had no argument against them without revealing more than he intended. What David did not realize was that I was following a structure he could not see. Every pause protected me. Every request documented his assumptions. Every delay forced him to repeat decisions he had never expected to justify. The lawyer had warned me that this stage would feel unnatural, because it required me to resist patterns I had lived in for decades. There were moments when he grew visibly frustrated. He accused me of complicating things. He said this did not have to be difficult. I listened and nodded, and reminded him that careful was not the same as difficult. That sentence stayed with him longer than he wanted. Privately, I began preparing. Not emotionally, but practically. I reviewed information. I organized timelines. I stayed disciplined. This was not about catching him off guard. It was about allowing reality to surface at its own pace while he continued believing speed was his ally. David still thought the divorce was under his control. He believed I was adjusting slowly. He believed the hardest part was behind him. That belief allowed him to relax again, and relaxation made him speak more freely than he should have. By the end of that phase, I understood something clearly. The moment he felt safe again would be the moment his certainty began to work against him. The first real crack appeared in a way David did not expect. It was not an argument or a confrontation. It was hesitation from people who had always moved quickly when he spoke, a response that took longer than usual, a decision that suddenly required confirmation. He noticed it immediately, even if he pretended not to. He came home irritated that evening and began talking more than necessary. He complained about delays, about how things were not moving as smoothly as they should. He framed it as inefficiency, but I recognized it for what it was. Uncertainty had entered a space where certainty had always lived. I listened without interrupting. I let him speak himself into clarity. He mentioned conversations he had assumed would be easy. He questioned why certain steps now required additional review. Each word revealed how much he had relied on momentum rather than substance. Momentum only works when no one slows it down. For the first time since the dinner, he asked me directly if I had spoken to anyone. The question was casual, but his posture was not. He was searching my face not for honesty, but for reassurance. I answered calmly and truthfully without explaining more than necessary. I said I was being careful. That answer unsettled him more than silence ever had. After that, his confidence shifted into vigilance. He watched what I said. He listened more closely. He began choosing his words with intention. The ease he once carried was gone. He could feel that something had changed even if he could not identify where. What David did not understand was that this moment was inevitable. The structure he depended on required ignorance to function. Once attention entered the picture, everything slowed down. And when things slow down, assumptions lose their power. That night I realized he was no longer moving forward comfortably. He was adjusting. And adjustment meant he was reacting, not leading. The balance he thought was permanent had already begun to tilt, and for the first time he was aware of it. Once David became alert, everything about him changed. He was still confident on the surface, but that confidence had edges now. He asked more questions than before. Not out of curiosity, but out of self-protection. He wanted to know what I knew without asking directly, because asking directly would have meant admitting uncertainty. He started revisiting conversations we had already had. He repeated points he believed were settled as if repetition could restore authority. I noticed how often he looked for agreement in my face, and how uncomfortable he became when I did not offer it automatically. Silence that once reassured him now unsettled him. The shift extended beyond our conversations. Decisions that used to move forward without resistance now slowed down unexpectedly. People asked for clarification. Timelines adjusted. What David thought was routine began to feel unpredictable. He responded by tightening his grip verbally, speaking more firmly, asserting outcomes rather than discussing them. I stayed consistent. I did not mirror his tension. I did not challenge him openly. I continued asking neutral questions and requesting confirmation in writing. Each request was reasonable. Each pause was justified, and each moment forced him to confront something he had never needed to face before. The lawyer had warned me about this phase. He said control rarely disappears loudly. It erodes quietly through process and accountability. Watching David struggle with that erosion confirmed everything I had learned. He was not losing because I attacked him. He was losing because reality no longer adjusted itself around his assumptions. At one point, he asked me why I seemed so calm. The question was meant to unsettle me, but it revealed more than he intended. Calm unsettles people who depend on emotional reactions to maintain leverage. I told him the truth. I said I understood more now, and that understanding brought peace. He did not respond to that. What he felt in that moment was not anger. It was exposure. He could sense that the version of the divorce he imagined no longer existed. He just did not know where it had gone, or how to retrieve it. That was when I understood that silence was no longer just protection. It was pressure. And the more he felt it, the more clearly his certainty continued to unravel. The realization did not come all at once for David. It arrived in fragments, small moments that did not make sense individually, but together formed a pattern he could no longer ignore. Conversations ended differently. Decisions paused where he expected progress. The certainty he relied on stopped responding the way it always had. He began expressing frustration in ways he never had before. Not anger, not shouting, but irritation disguised as logic. He questioned why processes were suddenly slower, why confirmations were necessary, why people wanted details that had never been required. Each complaint revealed how much he depended on moving forward without resistance. At home, he became restless. He paced during conversations. He corrected small details that did not matter. He talked more than usual, as if filling silence could restore control. I watched quietly, recognizing behavior I had lived with for years, only now it was directed at uncertainty rather than me. The first time he admitted something felt wrong, he framed it as inconvenience. He said the divorce was becoming more complicated than expected. That sentence mattered because it was the first time he acknowledged resistance. Complication meant friction, and friction meant he was no longer dictating the pace. I responded calmly and reminded him that careful processes take time. I did not accuse him. I did not reference the past. I stayed present and factual. That approach disarmed him more than confrontation would have. There was nothing for him to push against. What David did not realize was that the consequences he was beginning to feel were not new. They had always existed. They were simply hidden by momentum and my former silence. Now that momentum was gone, the structure underneath had nowhere to hide. That night, I understood something important. He was no longer moving toward the future he had planned. He was reacting to a reality he had not prepared for. And reaction strips power from people who believe they are always in control. By the end of that phase, he was no longer confident. He was cautious. And caution is the moment where certainty officially begins to fail. It was during a conversation he thought was routine that David finally understood something fundamental had shifted. He was explaining a next step with the same certainty he had used for months, when the response he received was not agreement, but hesitation. Not from me, but from the process itself. The path forward was no longer automatic. He tried to mask it with confidence. He laughed lightly and said it was just a delay, but his voice lacked conviction. I could hear it. He could feel it. The divorce was no longer unfolding according to his expectations, and that realization unsettled him more than any argument ever could. For the first time, he began speaking in hypotheticals. What if this took longer? What if things changed? What if adjustments were necessary? Those questions mattered, because they were not meant for discussion. They were meant to reassure him that control could still be reclaimed. I did not answer them directly. I acknowledged them, and stayed grounded in facts. That was when he looked at me differently, not with confidence or dismissal, but with evaluation. He was reassessing the dynamic between us, and trying to understand when exactly it had changed. He searched for a moment he could blame. A conversation. A reaction. Something obvious. There was nothing obvious. I realized then that the greatest advantage I had was not the information itself, but the timing. He had announced the divorce, believing the story began there. He did not realize the story had already been rewritten quietly, while he was focused on the performance of power rather than its foundation. David began asking questions he should have asked years earlier, not about me, but about the structure he depended on, and those questions came too late. They arrived after assumptions had already been recorded, and expectations had already been set. That night, he was quieter than usual, not calm, thoughtful. The kind of thought that comes when certainty has been replaced by calculation. He was no longer planning his future. He was trying to protect himself from an outcome he could finally sense, but not yet see. And I knew then that the next stage would not be about silence anymore. It would be about truth beginning to surface whether he was ready for it or not. The closer David came to understanding that something was wrong, the more carefully he tried to manage appearances. He became deliberate with his words, choosing them as if precision alone could restore the certainty he had lost. He no longer spoke freely. He measured reactions. He watched timing. Control had shifted from assumption to effort. I noticed how often he tried to return to the original narrative. He reminded me of how smoothly things were supposed to go, how simple this was meant to be, how unnecessary complications only made things harder for everyone. Those reminders were not for me. They were for himself. He needed to believe the story was still intact. What changed most was his patience. He had always relied on speed, on decisions moving quickly enough that questions never had time to form. Now, each pause felt threatening. Each delay suggested there was more beneath the surface than he had prepared for. And he was right. There was a moment when he almost asked directly. I could feel it building in his posture in the way he stopped mid-sentence and recalibrated. He wanted to know what I knew, but asking would have meant surrendering the belief that he still had the upper hand. So he chose caution instead. That caution revealed more than confidence ever had. He began protecting himself prematurely, clarifying statements, revising expectations, backtracking without admitting it. These were not the actions of a man in control. They were the actions of someone trying to minimize damage before fully understanding where it might come from. I stayed steady. I did not push. I did not correct his assumptions even when they were wrong. The lawyer had been clear. The truth does more work when it arrives through consequence rather than confrontation. Let him feel the structure shift before he sees it. By the end of that phase, David no longer spoke about the divorce as a clean exit. He spoke about it as something unpredictable. And unpredictability is the moment where confidence stops being useful. I could tell he was preparing himself for a truth he did not yet know how to face. And I knew that when it finally surfaced, silence would no longer be necessary. The conversation happened on an ordinary afternoon, which somehow made it heavier. There was no raised voice, no dramatic setting, no audience. David spoke as if he were revisiting a topic he believed we had already settled, but his tone gave him away. This time he was not explaining, he was testing. He said things were becoming more complicated than expected. He asked if I understood why certain delays were happening. He framed the questions as concern, but his eyes searched my face for something else. Confirmation, denial, anything that would restore the balance he felt slipping. I answered calmly and said I understood exactly why things were unfolding this way. That sentence changed the air between us. It was not confrontational, but it was precise. For the first time, I did not soften my words or hide behind neutrality. I did not accuse him. I simply acknowledged reality. He paused longer than usual. He asked what I meant, not casually, carefully. I could see the moment where he realized the version of me he had been speaking to no longer existed. Something in his posture shifted. He leaned back. He listened. I told him I had spoken to a lawyer before my birthday. I did not explain further. I did not list details. I watched his reaction instead. His face tightened just slightly. Not anger, calculation. He was already trying to measure what that information could mean. He asked why I had not told him sooner. I told him the truth. Because timing matters. Because listening matters. Because understanding the full picture changes how you speak about it. He did not respond immediately. That was the first moment he truly understood that his announcement at the dinner table had not been the beginning. It had been a miscalculation. The ground he believed was solid had already been examined from beneath. And for the first time since he asked for the divorce, David was not leading the conversation. He was waiting. After that conversation, David became quieter than I had ever seen him. Not distant, not withdrawn, focused. He was recalculating everything. I could tell because the questions he asked changed. They were no longer about timelines or outcomes. They were about limits, about what could be adjusted, about what might still be negotiable. He asked what the lawyer had told me. I did not answer immediately. I reminded him that he had always preferred to move quickly, and that speed had worked in his favor for a long time. Now, I needed clarity more than speed. That response frustrated him, because it mirrored the language he had used on me for years. When I finally spoke, I kept it simple. I told him the lawyer had shown me documents that explained decisions made without my consent, that certain financial actions required agreement that was never given, that the confidence he carried into the divorce was based on the belief that I would never question those details. His reaction was controlled, but not calm. He leaned forward. He asked which documents, which decisions, how much I knew. Each question revealed urgency. He was no longer protecting a plan. He was protecting himself. I did not list everything. I did not need to. I told him enough to make one thing clear. The divorce would not unfold the way he imagined. The advantages he assumed were not guaranteed. The structure he relied on had already been examined by someone who understood it better than either of us ever had. That was when he said something that surprised me. He said he had never thought I would look that closely. Not with contempt. With disbelief. That sentence explained our entire marriage more clearly than anything else ever had. I told him quietly that turning 50 had not made me fragile. It had made me attentive, and attentiveness changes outcomes. He did not respond to that. He sat back and looked at the floor. For the first time since the dinner table announcement, David understood that the silence he once interpreted as permission had been something else entirely. It had been the space where everything shifted. After that night, the balance between us was permanently altered. David no longer spoke as someone announcing outcomes. He spoke as someone measuring risk. His confidence did not disappear, but it narrowed. It became conditional, dependent on information he no longer controlled. The conversations that followed were different, slower, more careful. He asked what I wanted instead of assuming he already knew. That shift alone told me how deeply his certainty had been shaken. When someone accustomed to deciding begins asking questions, it is not curiosity. It is survival. I did not take advantage of that moment emotionally. I stayed grounded. I explained what the lawyer had made clear to me, that the decisions he believed were settled were not, that the protections he assumed were automatic depended on details he had ignored, that announcing a divorce does not erase responsibility. David listened, truly listened. Not because he wanted to understand me, but because he needed to understand his position. The power he thought he held had always depended on my silence. Once that silence was no longer ignorance, it became something else entirely. He tried to reframe the situation. He spoke about compromise, about fairness, about finding a way forward that worked for both of us. Those words came late. They came after confidence failed, and that timing mattered. What struck me most was how calm I felt. Not victorious, not angry, clear. The lawyer had not given me revenge. He had given me language. He had given me structure. And structure changes everything when emotions are no longer steering the conversation. David finally said he had underestimated me. He said it quietly, as if saying it out loud might make it permanent. I did not respond. Some acknowledgments do not require answers. By then, the outcome was no longer a question. The divorce would move forward, but not on his terms. The advantage he believed he secured at the dinner table had dissolved slowly through his own assumptions, and he knew it. The night before my birthday never left my mind, because it reframed everything that followed. Sitting in that lawyer's office did not turn me into a different person. It simply removed the blindfold. What he showed me was not dramatic or shocking in the way people imagine. It was precise, clear. It explained how much of my marriage had functioned on the assumption that I would never look too closely. David had asked for a divorce believing the announcement itself was power. He believed timing would weaken me. He believed witnesses would protect him. What he never considered was that the decision had already been examined before he ever spoke. The lawyer showed me exactly how his confidence rested on gaps he created and ignored, gaps that no longer worked once they were named. When the process concluded, it did not end in shouting or spectacle. It ended in recalibration. The divorce moved forward, but not as a performance of control. It became a process grounded in accountability. The advantage David believed he had secured disappeared quietly under the weight of facts he never expected to face. Turning 50 did not break me. It clarified me. I learned that silence is not always submission, and patience is not passivity. Sometimes the most powerful response is understanding the structure before responding to the noise. If you are listening to this and find yourself doubting your own clarity, remember this. You are not required to react on someone else's timeline. Understanding changes outcomes, and dignity does not require volume. Thank you for listening to my story. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. And if this story resonated with you, like, subscribe, and stay with me for the next one.